March 1943, a Luftwaffe intelligence briefing room outside Berlin, windows blacked out, air thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Major Günther Rall, one of Germany's deadliest fighter aces with over 200 confirmed kills, studied reconnaissance photographs spread across the table. The images showed America's newest fighter aircraft being unloaded at English airfields. He measured the dimensions against the Spitfires visible in the frame. Then he laughed. The other pilots leaned in to see what amused him. When they saw the specifications, they laughed too. The American fighter weighed 7 tons, empty, twice the weight of a Focke-Wulf FW190. It stood 14 feet tall. The fuselage looked like a milk jug, bulbous, ungainly, absurd. Someone coined the nickname on the spot, the Jug, short for Juggernaut, though it seemed more comedic than threatening. Hermann Göring himself reportedly chuckled when shown the intelligence file. Every principle of fighter design that had governed aerial combat since 1915 said the same thing: light, agile, maneuverable. The Americans had built the opposite. What none of them knew, what the laughter prevented them from seeing, was that in 18 months this ridiculous aircraft would achieve a kill ratio that would terrify every Luftwaffe pilot over Europe. Not through elegance, not through the dogfighting prowess that defined aerial combat mythology. Through something the Germans had never imagined a fighter could be designed for. Something that would validate a completely different philosophy of warfare. The P-47 Thunderbolt would kill 19 German aircraft for every one it lost. The pilots who mocked it in March 1943 would be calling emergency tactical meetings about it by December. The intelligence officers who dismissed it as American industrial excess would be writing frantic reports trying to explain how they'd missed what it actually was, because everyone, German and American alike, was asking the wrong question about the Jug. They were asking why anyone would build such a terrible fighter. They should have been asking what happens when you stop building fighters and start building destroyers. To understand how spectacularly wrong that initial assessment was, we need to go back to 1940. Republic Aviation Corporation's offices in Farmingdale, New York. Chief designer Alexander Kartveli sat at his drafting table with a problem that would define the next generation of aerial warfare. The U.S. Army Air Corps had issued requirements for a new fighter: high-altitude performance, heavy armament, long range, pilot survivability. Every aviation designer in America was working on the same problem. Most approached it the conventional way: refine existing designs, make incremental improvements, balance competing demands through careful compromise. Kartveli took a different approach. He started with the most powerful aircraft engine in existence, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows, 2,000 horsepower, massive, heavy, uncompromising. Then he built a fighter around it, not a fighter that happened to use that engine. A fighter designed entirely to exploit what that engine made possible. The result violated every orthodoxy. The P-47 Thunderbolt emerged from Republic's factory in 1941 with specifications that shocked everyone who saw them. Empty weight, 10,000 pounds. The Supermarine Spitfire, the gold standard of fighter design, weighed 5,000 pounds. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, Germany's frontline fighter, weighed 6,000 pounds. Loaded for combat with fuel, ammunition and pilot, the P-47 weighed 17,500 pounds. Later variants would push past 21,000 pounds. It measured 40 feet across the wingspan, 36 feet long, 14 feet high at the tail. Pilots climbing into the cockpit for the first time felt like they were boarding a small bomber. The view from the canopy was 13 feet off the ground. The armament was equally excessive. 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. Total rate of fire, 3,400 rounds per minute, combined. For comparison, the Spitfire carried 8 303 caliber machine guns with less than half the hitting power. The P-47's guns could saw through aircraft structures like chainsaws through plywood. All of this was powered by that enormous R2800 engine, equipped with a turbocharger the size of a beer keg. The turbocharger was the key. It maintained engine power at altitudes where other fighters gasped for air. At 25,000 to 30,000 feet, the P-47 retained full power, while Spitfires and Bf-109s struggled with thin atmosphere. The nickname emerged immediately: the Jug. Some claimed it stood for Juggernaut. Others said it was because the fuselage looked like a milk jug, wide, round, ungainly. Either way, it wasn't a compliment. Not initially. Fighter pilot culture in 1942 celebrated grace, agility. The romantic ideal of aerial combat was still shaped by World War I imagery: nimble aircraft dancing through the sky, pilots dueling with precision and skill. The great fighters of the early war years all embodied this: the Spitfire's elliptical wings, the Zero's impossible maneuverability, the Bf-109's knife-like performance. The P-47 looked like someone had strapped wings to a water tower. Late 1942. The 56th Fighter Group arrived in England equipped with P-47 Thunderbolts. They taxied past British airfields where Spitfire pilots watched, with undisguised amusement. The Americans climbing out of those enormous cockpits weren't amused, they felt betrayed. Most of them had trained on P-40 Warhawks or P-39 Airacobras. Conventional fighters, familiar, the P-47 felt like punishment. One pilot described his first flight as trying to dogfight in a locomotive. The controls were heavy. The aircraft didn't respond like a fighter. It responded like a fighter that had eaten 3 other fighters. Early combat missions confirmed their worst fears. The P-47 couldn't turn with a Focke-Wulf FW-190. In a turning fight, the lighter German fighter could get inside the P-47's radius and line up killing shots. It couldn't climb with a Messerschmitt Bf-109. The German fighter could escape vertically, and the P-47 pilots could only watch them go. In close quarters dogfighting, the kind of combat every fighter pilot trained for, the P-47 was outmatched. The loss rates in early 1943 reflected this. American pilots were dying. Not in catastrophic numbers, but enough to confirm what everyone already believed. The P-47 was a disaster. The Luftwaffe's assessment was even more dismissive. German pilots shot down several P-47s in those early months and examined the wreckage with something close to contempt. Intelligence reports filed to Berlin dripped with derision. One report from February 1943 described the P-47 as a flying tribute to American industrial excess with no regard for aerial combat principles. Another predicted the type would be withdrawn from service within 6 months, replaced by more sensible designs. Luftwaffe tactical bulletins advised pilots that the P-47 was vulnerable in turning combat. Exploit its weight, force it into maneuvers where its mass became a liability. The American pilots will make mistakes trying to fly it like a real fighter. German fighter ace Adolf Galland reportedly said the P-47 was proof that America didn't understand air combat. They were trying to win through brute force, more engine, more guns, more of everything, without grasping the fundamental principles that made a fighter effective. He was half right. They were using brute force. But the principles they were applying weren't the ones Galland thought governed aerial combat. By June 1943, the situation had reached a crisis point. The 8th Air Force was bleeding. American B-17 and B-24 bombers flying deep into Germany were being slaughtered by Luftwaffe interceptors. The bomber crews called these missions suicide runs. Loss rates on some raids exceeded 20%. Entire bomb groups were being decimated in weeks. The P-47 was supposed to provide fighter escort, but it had a fatal limitation: range. With internal fuel tanks only, the P-47 had a combat radius of 175 miles. The fighters would take off from England, escort the bombers partway into France, then have to turn back or run out of fuel. The Luftwaffe learned the timing perfectly. They'd wait until the American fighters turned back, then swarm the unprotected bombers. The bomber crews started calling the moment when the P-47s had to leave the departure of the Angels. After that, they were alone. The 8th Air Force desperately needed a long-range escort fighter. The P-38 Lightning had range, but its own problems with high-altitude performance in European weather. The P-51 Mustang was still being developed. The P-47 had the power, the armament, the altitude performance, but it couldn't reach Germany, and in the combat it was getting outmaneuvered and killed. In Washington, serious discussions began about cancelling P-47 production entirely. The aircraft was consuming enormous resources. Republic Aviation's factories were churning them out. But if they couldn't protect the bombers and couldn't survive dogfights, what were they for? The criticism wasn't just tactical, it was philosophical. The P-47 represented a massive investment in an aircraft that seemed to embody American engineering at its worst: overpowered, overgunned, overweight, and underperforming where it mattered. June 1943, Republic Aviation Headquarters. Alexander Kartveli received a telegram from the Army Air Forces. The language was bureaucratic, but the message was clear. P-47 performance in European theatre unacceptable. Justify continued production. Provide technical brief on aircraft capabilities and intended operational use. It was the kind of telegram that ended careers and killed programs. Kartveli sat at his desk and drafted a response that would change aerial warfare forever. But to understand his answer, to understand what he'd actually designed, we need to understand what the P-47 actually was. Because everyone, Allied and Axis, American and German pilots and commanders and intelligence officers, was asking the wrong question. They were asking, why can't the P-47 dogfight? The right question was, what happens when you build a fighter that doesn't need to? Kartveli's response arrived at Army Air Forces headquarters 3 days later. It wasn't defensive, it wasn't apologetic. It was a technical brief that redefined what a fighter aircraft could be. The P-47 Thunderbolt is not designed for turning combat at medium altitude, Kartveli wrote. It is designed for energy fighting, high-altitude interception, and survivability under combat conditions no other fighter aircraft can tolerate. He wasn't making excuses. He was explaining that everyone had been evaluating his aircraft against the wrong criteria. The brief laid out the P-47's actual advantages with engineering precision. The massive R2800 engine and turbocharger system delivered full power at 25,000 to 30,000 feet, altitudes where the FW-190's performance fell off dramatically, and the Bf-109 struggled to maintain combat effectiveness. At those heights, the P-47 was faster than anything Germany had. The 850 caliber machine guns weren't just heavy armament, they were a flying artillery battery. The combined weight of fire could destroy an enemy aircraft in a 2-second burst. For comparison, German fighters typically needed sustained firing to achieve kills. The P-47 needed to connect once, and the weight that everyone mocked, was structural durability. The P-47 could absorb battle damage that would disintegrate lighter fighters. It could bring its pilot home through conditions that would turn a Spitfire into a coffin. But Kartveli's brief identified something deeper. The P-47 wasn't designed to fight the way European air combat had evolved. It was designed to fight the way industrial warfare required: overwhelming firepower, absolute altitude superiority, and pilot survivability that allowed experienced combat veterans to accumulate missions instead of dying on their 5th sortie. The Army Air Forces read the brief. Then they sent it to the 56th Fighter Group's commander, Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, with a simple instruction: make it work. Summer 1943. Zemke gathered his pilots and showed them Kartveli's technical analysis. And then he said something that changed everything. Stop trying to dogfight. We're going to fight vertically. The tactic that emerged became known as boom and zoom. It was brutally simple. The P-47 would patrol at 28,000 to 30,000 feet, higher than German fighters typically operated. When they spotted enemy aircraft below, they'd dive. The P-47 could reach 550 miles per hour in a dive, faster than any Axis fighter in service. The pilot would close to firing range in seconds, deliver a devastating burst from 850 calibers, then use the speed and power to zoom back up to altitude. Never turn. Never try to maneuver with the enemy. Never engage on their terms. Use the P-47's advantages: speed in the dive, climb rate with accumulated energy, firepower concentration, and the durability to survive if something went wrong. It required discipline. Every instinct trained into fighter pilots said to pursue, to turn with the enemy, to dogfight until someone won. Boom and zoom required pilots to take one pass and then climb away, even if they hadn't scored a kill. It felt like running, but it wasn't running. It was energy fighting, managing speed and altitude as resources, exploiting them ruthlessly, never surrendering the advantage. The first pilots to master the technique were Captain Francis Gabby Gabreski and Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson. Both would become aces. Both would validate Kartveli's vision in blood and wreckage. July 1943, the kill ratio started shifting. Gabreski scored his first kills using pure boom and zoom tactics. Dive from 30,000 feet, close to 300 yards, fire a 3-second burst. Watch the FW190 come apart, climb back to altitude. The German pilot never knew what hit him, never had a chance to exploit his aircraft's superior turning ability, because the fight never entered the turning phase. Other pilots saw it work and adopted the tactic. The 56th Fighter Group's losses dropped. Their kills climbed. Word spread to other P-47 units. By August, boom and zoom was being taught as doctrine. The Luftwaffe noticed. Combat reports started changing in tone. German pilots who encountered P-47s using the new tactics found themselves in an impossible situation. They couldn't climb to the Americans' altitude before being bounced. They couldn't escape the dive attacks. They couldn't force the Americans into turning combat. And when they did manage to damage a P-47, the results were wrong. June 26, 1943, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson was flying escort over France when a Focke-Wulf FW190 got behind him. What happened next should have killed him. The FW190 pilot was competent, possibly experienced. He closed to optimal firing range and opened up with his 20mm cannons. Johnson's P-47 was hit repeatedly. The canopy shattered, filling the cockpit with wind and broken plexiglass. Cannon shells tore through the fuselage, opening the metal skin like paper. One shell struck near the cockpit, and Johnson felt the control stick go mushy. The elevator controls were nearly severed. His wingman counted 21 separate cannon strikes. The FW190 pilot probably assumed Johnson was finished. The damaged P-47 was trailing smoke. Its pilot was wounded, his face cut by shrapnel and plexiglass. Any other fighter, Spitfire, Bf-109, even an FW-190 would have gone down. The FW-190 broke off, looking for other targets. Johnson assessed his situation. The aircraft was badly damaged, but still flying. The engine was running rough, but producing power. The controls responded barely. He was 200 miles from the English coast. He made a decision that revealed everything about what Kartveli had actually built. He turned for home. The flight took 45 minutes. Johnson nursed the damaged P-47 across France, across the Channel, to his airfield in England. The engine never quit. The controls never failed completely. The aircraft kept flying despite structural damage that should have been catastrophic. He landed. When the ground crew examined the wreckage, they couldn't believe he'd made it back. 21 cannon hits, the fuselage punctured in multiple places, the canopy destroyed, hydraulic systems damaged, elevator control cables hanging by threads. Any other Allied fighter in service would have killed its pilot. The P-47 brought Johnson home. The story spread through every fighter squadron in England, not as folklore, as engineering validation. The reason the P-47 could survive this kind of punishment was built into every design decision Kartveli had made. The R2800 radial engine was the key. 18 cylinders arranged in a circle. Liquid-cooled inline engines like those in the Bf-109 and Spitfire had a fatal vulnerability. A single hit to the cooling system and the engine would overheat and seize within minutes. The pilot had maybe 5 minutes to find somewhere to crash land. The P-47's radial engine was air-cooled, no coolant system to rupture, and the cylinder arrangement meant the engine could lose 3 or 4 cylinders and keep running. Combat reports documented P-47s returning to base with multiple cylinders shot out, the engine running rough, but still producing enough power for flight. The pilot sat behind that massive engine, 2,000 pounds of metal between him and enemy fire. It wasn't deliberate armor, but it functioned like it. Rounds that would have killed a pilot in a Bf-109 instead struck engine components in the P-47. Behind the pilot, the fuselage was built with redundant systems, dual hydraulic lines, reinforced control cables, self-sealing fuel tanks that would close around bullet holes, armor plating around critical components. The aircraft was designed with a simple philosophy: assume it will be hit and engineer it to keep flying anyway. This was the industrial warfare thinking that Goering had mocked. The Germans built fighters to be efficient, elegant, optimized. One hit to a critical system could down them, but they were fast to produce and effective in skilled hands. The Americans built fighters to absorb punishment and bring pilots home alive. It took more resources, more weight, more engineering complexity. But experienced pilots stayed alive longer, accumulated more missions, became aces who trained the next generation. The attrition mathematics were brutal. Germany couldn't replace skilled pilots fast enough. America could keep them alive. Fall, 1943. Luftwaffe intelligence reports stopped being dismissive. An October report from Jagdgeschwader 2, one of Germany's elite fighter wings, contained a tactical bulletin that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. The American Thunderbolt must be engaged with caution. Turning combat remains advantageous to our aircraft, but pilots report the enemy has adopted non-standard tactics exploiting altitude and speed advantages. The aircraft is extremely difficult to destroy, multiple strikes required, ammunition, conservation necessary. Another report, this one from a technical intelligence unit examining downed P-47's aircraft construction philosophy, differs fundamentally from our own. Emphasis on survivability over performance optimization, structural redundancy excessive by our standards but effective in combat. Engine design permits continued operation after damage that would disable our inline engines. Assessment: aircraft represents industrial warfare philosophy, acceptable performance, maximum survivability, overwhelming firepower. They'd figured it out, but figuring it out didn't help them counter it. The P-47 operating at 30,000 feet with boom and zoom tactics was nearly untouchable. German fighters could achieve those altitudes, but couldn't maintain combat effectiveness there. The FW-190's performance fell off above 24,000 feet. The Bf-109 could reach 30,000 feet, but was sluggish, unable to maneuver effectively. And if German pilots did manage to damage a P-47, it probably wouldn't go down. It would limp home, get repaired, and return with the same experienced pilot who now had one more mission's worth of tactical knowledge. The laughter from March had stopped completely. December 1943. The final piece fell into place. Engineers solved the P-47's range problem by developing external drop tanks, large fuel tanks mounted under the wings that could be jettisoned when empty or when combat began. With two 150-gallon drop tanks, the P-47's combat radius extended from 175 miles to 475 miles. It could reach Germany now. The implications hit Luftwaffe planning like a hammer. Before December 1943, German fighters had sanctuary. The American bombers had to penetrate defended airspace without escort for hundreds of miles. Luftwaffe fighters could mass, attack at will, and withdraw to rearm. After December 1943, those same fighters had to contend with P-47s over their own airfields. The aircraft they'd mocked as too heavy to be effective was now loitering at 28,000 feet over Berlin, waiting to dive on anything that climbed to intercept the bombers. The tactical mathematics had inverted. The Luftwaffe was now fighting in the worst possible conditions, high altitude where the P-47 excelled, facing an enemy that refused to dogfight, unable to inflict decisive damage even when they scored hits. Zemke's 56th Fighter Group started running fighter sweeps over Germany, deliberately looking for combat, hunting Luftwaffe fighters aggressively. The predator-prey relationship had reversed. Colonel Zemke himself would eventually score 17.75 confirmed kills. Gabreski would reach 28 kills, making him the top American ace in Europe. Johnson would finish with 27 kills, all flying P-47, all using tactics that turned the aircraft's supposed weaknesses into devastating strengths. The Luftwaffe was about to learn what happened when an aircraft designed for industrial warfare met an air force designed for elegance and élan. The numbers would tell a story of absolute dominance. The final numbers, compiled after the war ended, told a story that validated everything Kartveli had designed and everything Zemke had proven. In the European theatre, from 1943 to 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt was credited with 3,752 confirmed air-to-air kills against German aircraft. Luftwaffe fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and all other causes accounted for approximately 200 P-47s lost in air-to-air combat. The kill ratio 19-1. 19 German aircraft destroyed for every P-47 lost in aerial combat. No other Allied fighter came close to this ratio in Europe. The P-51 Mustang, which dominates popular history and Hollywood mythology, achieved roughly 5-1. The Spitfire, Britain's iconic defender, managed approximately 2-1 in the later war years. The P-38 Lightning struggled to reach 2-1. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the aircraft that German intelligence had dismissed as a flying tribute to industrial excess, the fighter that Allied pilots initially hated, the design that violated every orthodoxy of aerial combat, became the highest-scoring American fighter aircraft of the European War. The mockery had turned to wreckage, German wreckage. The aces who proved it weren't anomalies. They were the visible edge of a systematic, tactical revolution. Robert S. Johnson, the pilot who survived 21 cannon hits and flew 200 miles home, finished the war with 27 confirmed kills, every single one scored in a P-47, every single one using boom and zoom energy tactics. He became the first USAF pilot in Europe to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 kills. Francis Gabby Gabreski went further. 28 confirmed kills, all in P-47s, making him the top-scoring American ace in the European theatre. His combat reports read like technical validations of Kartveli's engineering: high-altitude patrol, dive attack, gun camera footage showing target disintegration, climb back to altitude, repeat. Industrial, systematic, devastatingly effective. Hub Zemke, the commander who'd figured out how to use the aircraft correctly, scored 17.75 confirmed kills himself while running an entire fighter group. He turned the 56th into the highest-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force. His pilots called themselves Zemke's Wolfpack. The Luftwaffe had less flattering names for them. These weren't lucky pilots. They were engineers of destruction using an aircraft designed specifically for what they were doing. The P-47 didn't make bad pilots good, but it let good pilots survive long enough to become great, and it let great pilots accumulate mission counts that would have been suicidal in any other aircraft. That was the hidden mathematics of the 19-to-1 ratio. It wasn't just about destroying German fighters. It was about keeping American pilots alive long enough to become experts at destroying German fighters. But the P-47's versatility extended beyond air superiority. By 1944, its true adaptability became apparent in the most dangerous mission profile in aerial warfare: ground attack. The same durability that brought Robert Johnson home after 21 hits made the P-47 nearly ideal for low-altitude attack missions. Ground attack meant flying low and slow through concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Every machine gun, every flak battery, every rifle within range could hit you. Loss rates for ground attack aircraft were catastrophic across all air forces. The P-47 could survive it better than anything else flying. That massive radial engine could take hits from 20mm flak and keep running. The redundant systems kept the aircraft controllable even with significant damage. The armor protection designed for air combat worked even better against ground fire coming from below. And the aircraft could carry ordnance loads that seemed impossible for a fighter. With underwing hardpoints, the P-47 could haul 2,500 pounds of bombs, more than many medium bombers. It could carry rockets. And it still had those 850 caliber machine guns, which were devastating against ground targets. Pilots who'd learned to trust the Jug in air combat learned to trust it even more in the ground attack role. They called it the Jug that saved my life. Because when you were at 500 feet, strafing a German armored column with every gun on the ground firing at you, you wanted an aircraft that could take hits and keep flying. The ground attack statistics told their own story of dominance. June 6, 1944. The Normandy invasion, D-Day, P-47s flew close air support for the landings, attacking German defensive positions, armor concentrations and reinforcement routes. The Luftwaffe barely appeared. The P-47s and other Allied fighters had achieved such air superiority that German aircraft were nearly absent from the most important day of the war. But the ground support role was where the P-47 showed its full range. Thunderbolts destroyed German tanks, vehicles, artillery positions, and strong points throughout the day. When Allied troops called for air support, they often got P-47s, pilots who would dive through flak to hit targets within hundreds of yards of friendly positions, then climb back out trailing smoke but still flying. In the months after D-Day, as Allied armies pushed across France, P-47s flew thousands of ground attack missions. They hunted German armor. They interdicted supply lines. They shattered reinforcement columns trying to reach the front. The final accounting of P-47 ground kills is almost absurd in scale. 86,000 railroad cars destroyed, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, 68,000 trucks. These numbers represent the systematic destruction of German logistics and mobility across Western Europe. The P-47 wasn't just air superiority, it was comprehensive dominance, air and ground, high altitude and low fighter sweeps and close support. It was exactly what Kartveli had designed, a weapons platform optimized for survivability and firepower in an industrial total war environment. Total P-47 production reached 15,686 aircraft by war's end, more than any other American fighter type. The factories at Republic Aviation ran 3 shifts, turning out jugs at a rate that would have seemed impossible in 1940. At $83,000 per aircraft in 1944 dollars, they represented an enormous investment. That investment paid for 3,752 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. It paid for 86,000 railroad cars removed from Germany's logistics network. It paid for thousands of American pilots who came home alive because their aircraft could absorb battle damage that would have killed them in anything else. The P-47 served with distinction until 1955 in various air forces around the world, long after more modern designs had been retired. Its durability and reliability made it valuable long past its designed service life. But its legacy is complicated. In popular culture, the P-51 Mustang gets the glory. Hollywood loves the Mustang, sleeker, more elegant, with a better origin story involving British engines and American innovation. The P-51 looks like what people think a fighter should look like. The P-47 gets quiet respect from the people who flew it and the historians who understand what it actually accomplished. It's not romantic, it's not elegant, it's the aircraft that embodied industrial warfare at its most ruthlessly effective. Fighter pilots who survived the war because a P-47 brought them home through damage that should have killed them don't care about elegance. They care about seeing their families again. After the war, a researcher interviewed Luftwaffe ace Günther Rall about the aircraft he'd faced in combat. Rall had survived the war with 275 confirmed kills, the 3rd highest total of any pilot in history. He'd flown against every Allied fighter type. He'd studied their capabilities, exploited their weaknesses, and respected their strengths. When asked about the P-47, Rall was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We laughed at the Thunderbolt. Then we fought it. No one laughed twice." Oh, that was the story of the Jug, the absurd fighter that weighed twice what a fighter should weigh. The aircraft that couldn't dogfight, couldn't turn with German fighters, couldn't do what everyone believed fighters were supposed to do. The aircraft that achieved a 19-to-1 kill ratio by refusing to fight on anyone else's terms. Alexander Kartveli had designed a fighter for a different kind of warfare. Hub Zemke and his pilots had figured out how to use it, and thousands of American pilots had survived because of it. The Germans laughed in March 1943 because they were evaluating the P-47 against criteria that had defined aerial combat for 30 years: light, agile, maneuverable. The romance of the dogfight, the individual duel in the sky. Kartveli had built something else entirely, a survivable, high-altitude weapons platform optimized for energy fighting and industrial-scale warfare. An aircraft that kept its pilot alive, killed efficiently, and could be produced in overwhelming numbers. By December 1943, the Luftwaffe had stopped laughing. By May 1945, they'd stopped flying. And the Jug, ungainly, heavy, supposedly flawed, had helped ensure they'd never fly again. That's the final irony of the P-47 Thunderbolt. It succeeded so completely that it redefined what success meant. The question was never, can it dogfight? The question was, can it dominate the air war in every dimension that matters? The answer, written in 3,052 German aircraft destroyed and thousands of American pilots brought home alive, was yes. The Germans laughed at the Thunderbolt, then they fought it, then they lost.